My hand trembles against the window frame. I can see my reflection in the glass. Dull eyes, empty stare, a face I barely recognize. Funny how a single day, a single hour, can drain every last drop of color from a man's life. I stay like that for a long moment, trying to steady my breathing. The house behind me is silent, but inside my chest there's a storm. Even the simplest action, lifting my fingers away from the cool surface, feels monumental. I never used to be this way. There was a time when I was certain of myself, of my place in the world. Now I'm not sure I know who I am at all. I remember the night before it all shattered. Back then, the air smelled of hope, and the city lights reminded me how far I'd come. I was the dependable one. Sam, the good man, the devoted husband who walked through life with a quiet confidence. I like to think I earned respect through hard work, honesty, and a certain steadiness that made people trust me. My wife, Evelyn, well, Evie as I fondly called her, used to say I had this comforting presence, like a warm coat you slip into on a cold night. That feels like another life, another man entirely. It was a Tuesday when the first hint of betrayal slid into my world. I'd come home from work a little early, tired from a meeting that dragged on. I was rummaging in the kitchen for something to eat when I noticed a faint smell, cologne that definitely wasn't mine. The scent clung to the air, a subtle mix of musk and spice. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it came through the window from a neighbor. But it lingered. It wrapped itself around me until my mind couldn't ignore it. I remember standing there, gripping the counter, my eyes pinned to the door. Nothing looked different, but something felt terribly wrong. I couldn't bring myself to confront Evie right away. Instead, I sat on the couch when she returned. She walked in, apologized for being late, said something about traffic, and then leaned over to kiss my cheek. Her hair smelled of her usual shampoo, the soft floral fragrance I knew so well, but underneath it, there was that same faint note I'd caught in the kitchen. She offered a quick explanation about a dinner with colleagues. She sounded tired, maybe a little defensive, though at the time I told myself I was imagining it. I watched her walk to the bedroom to change, the click of her heels on the hardwood floor echoing ominously. The next few days passed in a haze. That sense of normalcy we used to have was gone. I found myself listening for everything, her tone of voice, the way she moved. We were always a team, or so I thought. But I felt her drifting, as if a silent wedge had been driven between us. She avoided eye contact at odd moments. Even her smiles seemed forced, like an actress performing a part. The worst part was not knowing if I was paranoid, or if my gut was right. A week later, a phone call came. I'd gone to pick up her phone by habit. She often forgot it around the house, and saw the name Marcus on the screen. I froze. Marcus, a man's name I'd heard in passing, sure, but never with any context that explained why he'd be calling at 9:30 at night. I answered, my voice dry, my heart hammering. The man on the other end hesitated. Then he asked, "Is Evie around?" She said she'd be here by now. My grip tightened. I forced my best casual tone. She's out. Not sure where. I was lying. I knew exactly where Evie was supposed to be that evening, working late at the studio, but something in this man's voice suggested otherwise. There was a tension there, almost a familiarity that made my skin prickle. I didn't ask her about it that night. Instead, I shut myself in the small study where I keep old photos and books. I stared at a photo of the two of us from our wedding day. She looked radiant in white, eyes bright with anticipation. My own smile was wide, genuine, reflecting an unshakable belief that I'd found the woman who would share my life forever. I traced the rim of the frame, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. In that moment, it struck me how quickly trust can crumble. I'd always believed in loyalty, in facing the world together. Now, a single phone call, a single unfamiliar smell, had me paralyzed in uncertainty. A few more days passed. Evie and I were like awkward strangers, circling around each other, each with something to hide. She avoided talking about her late nights, and I didn't press her directly, though inside I was a swirl of suspicion and dread. My job was also piling on stress, but the real weight was the shift in our marriage. I felt powerless, and I hated that feeling. I'd always considered myself a man in control of my schedule, my finances, my emotions, but this was beyond me. The ground beneath my feet felt cracked and dangerous, and I wasn't sure where to step next. Eventually, tension built to a point where I knew I had to do something. It happened one evening when Evie said she was going out for a work dinner. There was something about the slight tremor in her voice, the way she couldn't quite meet my eye, that confirmed my worst fears. She hurried out, leaving me alone in the house with my thoughts. My stomach twisted as I reached for my car keys. I told myself I was crazy. I told myself real men don't stalk their wives to confirm suspicions, but reason couldn't stop me. Hurt and jealousy fueled my actions. I parked across the street from the upscale restaurant where Evie said she'd be. I waited, the engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Lights glowed through the windows. People walked in, smiling, well-dressed. Time ticked by. At last, I spotted her stepping out of a car that wasn't a taxi. The door opened, and out came a man, a tall figure, in a crisp shirt, dark hair, and a confident stride. He put his hand lightly on her back, guiding her toward the entrance. She looked up at him, and there was a warmth in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long while. I can't describe the numbness that took hold of me. I should have felt rage, betrayal, heartbreak. Maybe I did, but it was as if all those emotions got stuck in my throat, choking me from the inside. I just stared, my heart pounding, my breathing shallow. I wanted to burst out of the car, confront them both, demand answers. Instead, I snapped a photo with my phone, my hand trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. Something deep inside me died in that moment, a piece of my faith in love and commitment. I followed them from a distance as they entered the restaurant. They sat at a corner table, leaning in close. I saw Evie's face light up when she spoke to him. I watched him reach for her hand across the table. The gesture was subtle, but so intimate it made my chest tighten like a vice. I turned away, unable to witness more. My mind reeled. Perhaps I was partially to blame, I thought. Maybe I hadn't been attentive enough. Maybe work had taken over. Maybe the tragedy we once suffered, losing a child we never even got to bring home, had driven a wedge between us. But those thoughts couldn't excuse the betrayal unfolding before me. I managed to slip out without them noticing. I drove aimlessly, chest heavy, stomach twisted in knots. I ended up at the Chicago River, parking along a deserted stretch of road. I got out of the car, walked to the railing, and stared at the water. The city skyline rose in the distance, bright and indifferent. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually the cold wind forced me back into reality. I tried to breathe, tried to calm the trembling in my legs. My life had become a nightmare. Part of me wanted to go home, bury my head in the pillows, and pretend this wasn't happening. But I couldn't. Something in me snapped. In the days that followed, Evie tried to maintain the lie of normalcy. She pretended everything was fine, gave me the usual peck on the cheek in the morning, called me sweet names out of habit. But I felt the distance growing even more. My resentment festered, yet I couldn't bring myself to confront her in a shouting match. That's never been my style. Instead, I watched, I listened, I waited. We had an argument one Saturday morning about something trivial. Car maintenance, I think. Her voice had a defensive edge I'd never heard before. I saw the flash of guilt in her eyes. I realized then that direct confrontation wouldn't get me the truth. She was too deep in this lie to admit it easily. So I made a decision. I would gather proof, let her corner herself with her own deceit. Call it pride, call it revenge, but I needed to see her face the ugliness she tried to hide. The opportunity came quicker than I expected. She went out yet again, claiming she had urgent errands for a client's interior design project. Later that evening, I received a text from a friend who knew I was suspicious, though he didn't know details. He simply wrote, "Saw Evie at a hotel bar on the north side. She didn't see me." My jaw clenched so hard I thought I'd break my teeth. A hotel bar. So it was no longer just dinners. I drove there, my mind buzzing with 1,000 different worst-case scenarios. When I arrived, I spotted her in the lobby, standing near the elevator with the same man from before. Marcus. She looked nervous, glancing around as though worried someone might see. My heart hammered so violently I felt dizzy. I wanted to storm over, but something else took hold of me. An almost clinical detachment, as though I was watching a grim documentary about a stranger's life. I quickly positioned myself out of sight, using my phone camera. I recorded them getting into the elevator together, his hand at the small of her back. The doors slid shut with a quiet ding, sealing away any last shred of doubt. Everything after that moved in slow motion. I found myself climbing the stairwell, desperate to confirm, but also terrified of what I'd find. Floor by floor, my breath turning ragged. At the 7th floor, I paused, listening. The corridor was empty, hushed. My feet carried me forward. I saw Evie's heels lying on the floor outside one of the rooms, as if discarded in a hurry. A soft laugh drifted through the door, and then something else. A moan that sent a burning wave of nausea through me. My hand shook so violently that I struggled to keep the phone steady. The Do Not Disturb sign hung on the handle, mocking me. I had all the evidence I needed, but I couldn't tear myself away. Despite the horror, I needed one more moment of absolute certainty, a sick fascination pulling me closer. I recorded the sounds, each muffled gasp, each rustle. There was an erotic charge in the air, invasive and shattering. I felt my stomach churn. My wife was inside that room, sharing a moment of intimacy and abandon with another man. The final blow. I heard her whisper his name. Marcus, in a soft, breathless way she once used for me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the phone. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. I don't remember how I got home. The next clear memory I have is sitting on our living room couch, phone in hand, the recorded audio file glowing on the screen like a cursed object. Hours must have passed, because the room was dark, and the clock read past midnight. I felt hollow, like a piece of driftwood tossed on shore after a violent storm. I wanted to cry, scream, break something, but I just couldn't. That emptiness was worse than rage. Rage can fuel you, but emptiness leaves you stranded. Evie came home after 1 a.m. I watched her from the couch as she stepped inside. She looked startled to see me awake, but quickly donned a smile. "I'm sorry I'm late," she offered. "Had to finalize some design details." She trailed off, noticing my expression. Silence swallowed the room. I didn't speak. I just stared, letting her words hang between us. Her smile faltered. Her eyes shifted. She could sense something was off, but she didn't know how much I knew. I didn't accuse her then. Instead, I rose, brushed past her, and went to bed, leaving her there in the dimly lit hallway. My throat burned from holding back every searing question. But I had a plan, if you can call it that. I needed her lies to unravel in front of me, so I could see the truth in her eyes without any doubt. The next day, I barely spoke. She tried to ask what was wrong, but I retreated into clipped nods and monosyllabic replies. She grew tense, pacing around the house. More than once, I caught her glancing at her phone, anxious. Perhaps she was waiting for a message from him. My stomach tightened at the thought. 2 days later, everything came to a head. She returned from another late outing. This time she'd said it was a work meeting with clients. I was in the living room, phone in hand, the same phone that held that damning recording. When she walked in, I stood up and faced her. I wasn't trembling now. My body felt unnaturally calm, like the eye of a hurricane. I said nothing at first. I simply reached out, pressed play, and held the phone so she could hear. For a few seconds, she didn't register what the sounds were. Then understanding spread across her features. Her eyes widened in horror as the faint echoes of moans and murmured words filled the silence of our home. She clasped her hands to her mouth. Tears sprang to her eyes. She shook her head, stepping back, as if the phone itself was a loaded gun. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't form. I said her name, quietly, fighting to keep my voice steady. Evie. That single syllable must have cut through her because she started to break down. Her shoulders shook, and sobs tore from her throat. I watched her crumble, a part of me hating the pity that welled up inside. But I also felt something else, a cold fury that had been waiting, biding its time. She tried to explain, stammering, words falling over each other. He. This happened after we started drifting apart. I didn't mean. All excuses bulled together into a shapeless mass of desperation. I listened, or at least I stood there while she spoke. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and my mind replayed the memory of that hotel door, of her whispered plea to him, the closeness they shared. I calmly asked, "How long?" My voice sounded alien, even to me. She hesitated, tears staining her cheeks. "A couple of months," she finally admitted, her voice cracking. I swear it was only because we were so distant, and I felt alone. And she trailed off, seeing no mercy on my face. "I never planned to hurt you. I still love you, Sam. It was a mistake." A bitter laugh escaped my lips, surprising even me with its trayness. A mistake. Something trivial, something you slip on like ice. Except it wasn't. It was a knife in my back, a scalding betrayal. I didn't yell. I didn't slam doors or break anything. I simply stared at her, letting the weight of her actions drown her. She reached for me, but I stepped back. Her outstretched hand trembled, and new tears streamed down her face. I recognized a raw panic in her eyes, the same panic I once felt in that hotel corridor. Now she was the one caught, cornered by her own lies. She tried to step closer, tried to embrace me. But I turned away. "Don't," I said quietly. My voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "You made your choice. And now you want me to forgive and forget just like that." She shook her head frantically, stammering apologies. Each one felt like a hollow echo, devoid of real meaning. We stood in silence for a long while. Neither of us moved. I could see the years of our marriage flashing through my mind. Holidays spent laughing. Nights we lay awake dreaming of a future together. That day we lost our baby, and how we clung to each other, sobbing as one. All that history, all that love, now overshadowed by the bitter taste of betrayal. My chest felt like it was about to cave in. I had no idea what to feel. Anger, sorrow, maybe some twisted relief that the lies were finally exposed. Ultimately, all I felt was emptiness. At some point, I turned away and walked down the hallway to our bedroom. She followed, pleading, but I locked the door. I needed a moment to gather myself, to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Alone in the dark, I pressed my back against the wall and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. I heard her sobs on the other side, and for a second I wanted to rip the door open and hold her. Then the memory of that elevator door, that "Do Not Disturb" sign, flashed in my mind, and any pity I felt turned to cold resolve. Time blurred. She eventually moved away from the door. I spent what was left of the night in a tortured half-sleep, haunted by images and half-formed nightmares. Morning came, gray light seeping in through the curtains. I got up and walked out to find her curled on the couch, eyes swollen and red. She looked up at me, so lost, so desperate, but my sympathy was numb. I told her I was going out, didn't say where. She wanted to stop me, ask me 100 questions, but she just nodded, tears in her eyes. I grabbed my phone, keys, wallet, and left. In the car, I breathed deeply, feeling an odd sense of calm in my chest. I pulled away from the driveway, not sure of my destination. My thoughts drifted to the profiles of the man I used to be, the woman I believed her to be, the illusions we both created. Everything was shattered. The only thing left was the question of what I would do with the pieces. I ended up at a coffee shop near my office. I sat in a corner booth, ignoring the pastries and black coffee going cold in front of me. A coworker recognized me, waved, but I pretended not to see. My mind raced through scenarios. Maybe I confront Marcus. Maybe I demand a divorce. Maybe I fight for this marriage if she begs for forgiveness. Each possibility tasted bitter. My phone buzzed. 3 missed calls from Evie. I turned it face down on the table. That afternoon, I made a plan. It wasn't elaborate, but it was final. I decided I wouldn't give her a chance to spin more lies. We needed closure. Part of me wanted retribution, to see the look on her face when she realized I wasn't the docile husband she'd grown used to. Another part just wanted to vanish from this painful story, but I'd never been the type to leave with a whimper. I wanted her to feel, even for a moment, the searing betrayal that had devoured me from the inside. I returned home earlier than she expected, found her pacing the living room. The tension in the air was palpable. Before she could speak, I held up a hand. "Don't," I said quietly. She swallowed whatever words she'd been about to say. I walked to the bookshelf, pulled out the small digital camera I placed there, then set it on the coffee table. I could see her face go pale. She recognized the significance, proof, undeniable, that I had more than just the audio on my phone. I turned my heartbreak into an arsenal of evidence. She sank onto the couch, pressing her hands to her temples. I stood over her, arms crossed, voice low. "I can't stay here anymore," I said. Her eyes flickered with a wild fear. "Sam," she whispered, "please, we can work on this. I can." "No." The single word came out like a bullet. I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them show. "I gave you years of my life. I gave you trust. I gave you everything I had. And you." I trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence without unraveling. Her lip trembled. She reached for me again, but I stepped back. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, voice trembling. I stared at her for a long moment. The woman I married was in front of me, but so was a stranger who'd shared her body, her heart, with another man. I thought about the final card I had to play. Without a word, I pulled out my phone and tapped a video file. It showed them entering the hotel elevator. The angle was shaky, but it was clear enough. Her face, his face, their closeness. Her jaw dropped, tears filling her eyes again. She whispered my name as if it were an apology. I pressed play, letting her see a snippet of them in the hallway. Then I paused it on the image of Marcus's hand on her waist. She crumpled into sobs, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, pity flared in me again, overshadowed by the raw agony that had hollowed me out for the last several days. I wanted to smash the phone, break something, anything. But I just inhaled slowly. She started to speak, but I shook my head. "No more words, Evie. I'm done." I walked to the bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag, and threw in some clothes. She followed, pleading, tears streaming. Her voice shook as she tried to explain, to tell me how lost she'd felt, how she never meant for things to go this far. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing. After I packed what I needed, I turned to her one last time. Her eyes were swollen, red, her face streaked with remorse. I must have stood there a full minute, remembering all the laughter, the dreams, the gentleness that once defined our relationship. That life was gone now, ruined by an act I could never unsee, never unhear. I brushed past her and headed for the front door. She cried my name, but I didn't look back. The world outside felt oddly still, as if it were waiting for me to decide who I would become now. I put my bag in the trunk, slid into the driver's seat, and stared at the steering wheel. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked haunted, older than before. I let out a shaky breath, turned the key, and drove away. I ended up at a hotel on the other side of town. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I needed a place to think, to exist without the memories that soaked every corner of our shared home. The clerk at the reception desk was polite, handed me a keycard. I made my way up to the room, closed the door behind me, and just stood in the empty space. There, in the quiet, I allowed myself the luxury of tears. I sank to the floor, my back against the bed, and sobbed. Anger, heartbreak, betrayal, everything I'd held inside came pouring out in agonized gasps. In the midst of that emotional wreckage, I found an odd sense of relief, like a man who'd been suffocating finally gulping fresh air. It was over. The illusion was shattered. Whatever came next, at least I wouldn't be living in the dark, clueless, or doubting my every instinct. The future was a question mark, but the lie was laid bare. That night, I slept like the dead. No dreams, no nightmares, just an empty void until morning. When I woke, the ache in my chest was still there, but I felt a tinge of clarity. I had the day off from work. I'd arranged it beforehand, anticipating I might need time after confronting Evie. I got dressed in the same clothes from the day before, feeling grimy, but not caring. My phone buzzed repeatedly with calls and messages from her. I left them unanswered. I needed space, needed to figure out my next step. Despite everything, I found myself driving to the same stretch of the Chicago River where I'd once found solace. The water flowed steadily, uncaring of my personal collapse. I leaned on the railing, letting the breeze hit my face. Memories washed over me. Our first real date by this river, the date I told her I loved her. The evening we found out she was pregnant. And then, the day we lost everything, and how we clung to each other for dear life. It was painful to recall it all, but necessary. I had to acknowledge the good times, even as I recognized they were gone. My phone vibrated again. I glanced at the screen. Marcus's name flashed in a text message, ironically forwarded by Evie. My stomach clenched. I hesitated, then opened the text. He'd written to her, "I'm worried about you. Please talk to me." My grip on the phone tightened. All I could think was, of course he's worried. He probably knows the cat's out of the bag. My rage spiked, but it was quickly replaced by a numb sense of inevitability. I typed back, "This is Sam. Don't contact her again." I sent it, then blocked his number. Maybe it was petty, but it felt like something I needed to do. For a while, I just stood there, phone in hand, the cold metal of the railing pressed against my stomach. Then I made a call to a lawyer friend, someone who could advise me. He picked up after a couple rings, recognized my voice, and listened quietly as I stumbled through an explanation of what happened. He didn't judge. He just told me the process for separation, the potential steps if I wanted a divorce, and recommended I take my time to think it through. "You sound shattered, man," he said softly. "Give yourself space. Don't rush it, but protect yourself." I thanked him and ended the call, feeling both overwhelmed and strangely comforted that I had a path forward, however painful it might be. I spent the rest of the morning wandering the city aimlessly, letting the sounds of traffic and the bustle of strangers dull my inner turmoil. By midday, hunger reminded me I was still a living, breathing person with basic needs. I stopped at a sandwich shop, forced down half a meal, and left the rest. Then I walked again, no destination in mind. I was mentally replaying every moment of betrayal, every subtle lie. I found myself seeing the man I used to be, a hopeful husband, a loyal friend, a steady provider, and I barely recognized him now. That naive trust was gone. Something colder, more guarded, had taken its place. Late in the afternoon, I returned to the hotel and showered, scrubbing my skin as if I could wash away the entire ordeal. When I emerged, I saw a message from Evie. "Please come home. Please, Sam." "I'm so sorry." I turned off the screen without replying. I dried my hair, dressed in fresh clothes, and sat on the edge of the bed. The thought of going back to that house felt impossible. Could I even look at the walls without remembering the stale scent of betrayal? Night fell. I lay awake in the dark, the only light coming from the thin line beneath the door. I replayed her tearful face when I showed her the video, the devastation in her eyes. Part of me wondered if I was too harsh, if maybe she deserved a chance to mend things. Another part insisted there was no going back from this. Could I ever trust her again? Could I ever push aside the image of her whispering another man's name? Sometime close to midnight, I drifted into a fitful sleep. I dreamed of an empty house, every room locked except one. Inside that room, I could hear voices, hers, his, mine. When I opened the door, no one was there, just echoes. I awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the sheets twisted around my legs. It took several minutes before I could breathe normally again. The following morning, a coworker called, needing input on a project. Work was the one area of my life where I still felt somewhat capable. I told him I'd come in for a couple of hours. That was a lie. I ended up working almost the entire day, burying myself in spreadsheets, emails, phone calls. In the calmness of routine tasks, I found a kind of solace. But even that didn't last. Eventually, I had to leave, to face the reality waiting for me outside the office walls. Late that evening, as I sat in the hotel bar, nursing a single whiskey, Evie called again. I could have ignored it, but a strange impulse made me pick up. Her voice was trembling. She told me she understood if I needed space. She begged me not to throw everything away yet. "I'll move out," she offered. "I'll give you time." Sam, I don't want to lose you forever." I listened, silent, the burn of whiskey in my throat, the hum of heartbreak in my chest. "I'm not sure what I want," I said, after a long pause. "You already lost me the moment you slept with him." She sobbed quietly on the other end. I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar pang of pity. "Evie, I can't." I started, but my voice trailed off. I ended the call, not wanting to give her false hope or subject her to more scorn. Days turned into a week. I stayed at the hotel, occasionally checking in with my lawyer friend, occasionally going to work. Evie texted updates. She packed some clothes, left the house, and gave me the space I asked for. She asked if we could talk in person once I felt ready. Meanwhile, she claimed she ended things with Marcus. I didn't respond. Perhaps that was cowardly, but I was too raw to face the complexities of whether or not I could forgive her. In the quiet nights, I realized that I had found a strange sense of freedom in letting go. The anger was still there, but less suffocating. The sorrow was deep, but it was also clarifying. I no longer wondered about the suspicious cologne, the phone calls, her dinners. I knew the truth. In that sense, my mind felt eerily calm, free from the web of lies. Sometimes heartbreak is a step toward a new kind of clarity. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe I'll go through with the divorce, or maybe I'll find some twisted sense of closure in a separation that lingers until we both decide. Part of me wants to believe that broken things can be mended, but another part has no energy to try. Even if I forgave her, I'm not sure I could forgive myself for letting it happen under my nose. What I do know is that I've reached a turning point. I can't be the same man I was before all this. A certain hardening of the spirit has set in. But there's also a quiet determination. I don't plan to remain a victim, wallowing in resentment. I want to rebuild myself. Whether that process includes Evie or not, only time will tell. For now, I choose to carry my scar with dignity. Proof that I gave my heart, was betrayed, and survived. That alone feels like a kind of victory. One evening, I returned to the house, our house, just to see if I could bear the memories. I walked through each room, recalling the laughter, the warmth, and then the cold aftermath of betrayal. The emptiness hit me hard, but there was also a sense of finality. I left a note on the kitchen table. It read simply, "I need time. Don't call me. I'll be in touch." I didn't sign it with love. I couldn't. Stepping back outside, I locked the door behind me. For a moment, my hand stayed on the knob. Trembling like it did that first night, I caught the scent of another man's cologne. I remembered that old version of myself, a man who believed he'd always be enough for her. In a way, that innocence was what died in this house. Now, as I slipped the key into my pocket, I felt both despair and a certain measure of release. In losing that old self, maybe I'd find a new one, a man who knows the weight of betrayal and still finds the strength to stand up and walk away. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked to my car under the dim glow of the street lamp. The night was cold, and the city felt vast and indifferent. But there was a flicker of resolve in my chest. I slid behind the wheel, closed my eyes for a moment, and let out a long, steady exhale. Then, finally, I drove off into the darkness, feeling the stirring of something I could only describe as freedom.